welcome today. Great turnout, and this is our first Indigenous governance speaker for our speaker series. So thank you for coming out today on this great fall day. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Isabel Altamirano-Jimenez, Zapotec, and she's also associate professor in political science and Indigenous studies at the University of Alberta. She's done this amazing work over the years. Big fan of her work on marketing of Indigenous citizenship, comparative approaches of Indigenous struggles in both Canada and in Mexico. And some of the work that I've seen from her lately has been focused on Indigenous women and their relationship to water. And so she's got a large grant that she's working on with that. But she has a new book out that I highly recommend, Indigenous Encounters with Neoliberalism, and Place, Women, and the Environment in Canada and Mexico. So I'll keep the introduction short, but definitely check out her work, and it's an honor to introduce her.
Thank you, Jeff. Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. I'm really grateful to the people of this land for hosting me here today. And I also want to thank Jeff and Taiyake for the invitation to be here with you today. I really appreciate to be in this beautiful setting and have the opportunity to talk to you about my new book. I would like to start by saying that, sort of like looking back at the book, and conducting the research for this book has taken me on a journey as a Zapotec, as a woman, and as an academic. This book, I think I would say that it has been shaped by who I am as a Biniza or Zapotec, and by my relationships with my community. The book also draws on my doctoral dissertation, where I focus on the relationship between Indigenous nationalism, gender, and tradition. I became concerned at the time that most theories of nationalism were not reflecting on the experiences of Indigenous women, but mostly women of color. And there were just a few studies done by Indigenous scholars talking about self-determination and gender. For my doctoral dissertation, I formulated these questions. How useful is the language of nationalism to talk about Indigenous politics? In what ways do Indigenous women relate to nationalism, and how Indigenous men and women envision decolonized spaces? I look at Canada and Mexico and 4 locations. The Tehuantepec Isthmus in Oaxaca, in southern Mexico, that's where I come from. The Zapatista movement in Chiapas, the Nishga Nation, and Nunavut. I was committed to include Indigenous people's perspective, particularly women's voices, and I asked for guidance to approach these different communities, and obviously sought for ethics research approval. As there were some important limitations in my doctoral dissertation, including the fact that in the case of Oaxaca and Chiapas, particularly in Chiapas, where a low-intensity war was developing at the time, my research became flexible. And what I mean by flexible is that instead of being in one location, in one community, I follow research participants to different forums, community meetings, and so on. I did exactly the same with Zapotec leaders and activists. Due to logistic issues that I was following these research participants, and that's what I mean by it became flexible. When in the locations in Canada, in Nunavut, I concentrated mainly in Iqaluit, and in the Nass Valley, I focused mainly in Neo-Ayanj. So like the experience of going into these locations was very important in itself. You know, was part of negotiating what is being Indigenous at the time in different locations. And it was a process where I was interviewing research participants, but at the same time, they were interviewing me. So like, what are you doing here? Why is this interesting? Why, like, they wanted to know exactly where I came from, and what, you know, like what kind of relationship they could make with the experiences in other countries and Canada as well. I would say as well that going to these different places allowed me to understand some of the similarities and differences that exist in these two countries. So 5 months after I defended my dissertation, I traveled to my home community to spend some time with my family. As we were having breakfast one day, my father asked me if I knew anything about wind power. He explained that some people were looking for him as the elected head of the Agrarian Assembly to talk about creating wind power parks. At the time, I didn't know much about wind power generation, but my father asked me to go with him at a meeting. And during this meeting with a government representative and a CEO from a Spanish company, it was clear that the language that these visitors were using were extremely technical when they were talking about wind power generation. So technical that we barely get something out of it. What was clear to me from that conversation were two things. One is that these people's characterization of my community. And the other thing was the need for my community to absorb part of the risk of creating these wind parks. When these people were talking about community, basically they referred to Zapotistas, to the Zapotecs, are people that basically sitting on a big asset, their land, and that they were not doing anything with it. They were basically saying that agriculture and subsistence agriculture specifically was unproductive, retrograde, and in need of change. That environmental degradation suddenly became our fault. We were causing all these problems. And they barely say anything about how the government throughout decades have been changing land uses in the region, created dams and industry. None of these were part of that equation. They also talk about the land as being wasteland, the need to do something about it. Days later, my dad told me that the visitors had come back and that this time they were very direct. They wanted somehow to bribe him to convince the communal assembly to rent lands to wind power corporations. My father explained to them that is not the way it works. When you have an agrarian communal assembly, decisions have to be made by consensus. And this is the authority, the collective authority, that make decisions on indigenous land. The fact that my father was the head of the assembly didn't mean anything else, but just a facilitator. So in this context, my father asked me to do some research about this. Specifically, he was really, really concerned about leasing agricultural lands and what would that mean for indigenous peoples living and depending on the land. For him, subsistence is not a backward way of living, but it's a way of living that connects you to your own roots, that is part of a more complex systems of governance and resource allocations and so on, and that was central. And that's something that he wanted to keep as part of this process. As I got engaged in these projects, I realized that my community wasn't alone. There has been a global trend of pushing small farmers off their lands. Although there is difficult to have a number, Oxfam estimates that in the global south, at least 227 million hectares have been either sold, leased, or licensed to foreign companies between 2000 and 2011. In 2009 alone, 50 million hectares were transferred from farmers to corporations. Some of this land has been purchased, while the majority, which is whole communally, has taken on long-term leases of 25 years to 99 years. It was clear that international agencies and research centers, such as the World Bank, International Development Research Center, and the United Nations environmental programs were pushing for these kind of initiatives in the Global South, for the benefits of corporations in the Global North. It was also clear that they clearly distinguish between different types of landscapes. Forest communities have been encouraged to reduce their footprints and to engage in the provision of environmental services. Land used by small farmers for their own food is converted into plantations to produce biofuels, green energy, to offset carbon or mono-agricultural products. To me, this suggested that a new global land grab is in the making, and the implementation of the new land uses disproportionately favor multinational corporations and governments over local people and their uses, land uses. Land grabbing can involve more than land itself. It can imply grabbing the power to control land and water and other resources. Land grabbing also doesn't always require the expulsion of peasants from their lands, but rather depend on their very presence to draw some benefits, as it is in the case of forests. As I continue to engage with this research, I started seeing the 4 locations that I had visited and that I have focused on my dissertation. At the time I had visited the Nass Valley, some Nisga'a people were already talking about planting trees in some of the areas that deforested areas in their lands. When I visit Chiapas, for instance, I realized similar process of reorganization of communities along their livelihoods and the level of social organizations that they had. So land, the other thing that I realized is that although we always have this tendency to believe that these kind of processes are happening in the only in the Global South, land grabbing is also part of what we call the Global North. When I thought of Nunavut, it would seem that this was the only case in which a different economic model was being implemented. In this part of the world, climate change and its effects were opening new economic possibilities that were not considered before an alternative. Unlike the other locations where accumulation by dispossession is being implemented, in Nunavut we could see what is being called accumulation by degradation. Initially, I had some difficulties making sense of these different processes of neoliberalization, partly because only few studies had explicitly connected neoliberalism and indigenous rights. I started seeing a pattern among the cases, and the fact that some landscapes and some people were being produced as wild, while others were being constructed as taking advantage of the environmental crisis, is not a contradiction. As Indigenous Encounters with Neoliberalism shows, these simultaneous processes are central to new forms of capital accumulation that no longer rely exclusively on natural resources, but on a whole range of environmental commodities. From this point of view, far from being untouched by humans, wilderness is the social construction of specific societies and times. From this perspective, looking at these experiences, to me, it was really important to look at the practices and performativity as a means to look into how a fixed meaning of indigeneity rests on binary oppositions between civilization and nature. More important to this book, how a fixed understanding of indigeneity is defined in relation to the environment is useful to understand how gender is produced in relation to the production of nature, but also is useful to understand how some indigenous peoples are being misrecognized when compared to this fixed understanding of indigeneity. Because Undeveloped ecosystems are often found within indigenous traditional territories. These peoples are confronted with tensions between local needs and global wants. Tensions and contradictions are negotiated through discourses of identity, rights, and the environment, which serve to define and normalize certain embodied experiences. As Sison points out, binary dichotomies and authenticity continue to shape state policies and have been integral to the foundation of all colonial nations, and it continues to haunt the recognition of indigenous land title and its intersection with issues of the economy and conservation. In this context, indigeneity is bracketed by tradition, so change and adaptation is permissible as long as the customs remain traditional enough. The ideology of authenticity don't simply describe, but is also performative in helping shape the condition of the world. From this point of view, the main achievement of universalizing indigenous rights is not its accurate description, but its enactment of indigeneity in a specific way. Through the linking of indigeneity and the environment to the market, neoliberalism has shaped forms of recognitions and systems of environmental governance and development mediated by international financial institutions which emphasize accountability and compliance. Through a process of re-regulation and liberalization, indigenous territories have become property, and indigenous people's relationship to these territories are being commodified. It is not only nature that becomes constitutive of economic life, but also the relationship established between the human, non-human realms. The insertion of indigenous people's worldview into the global economy, where conservation and natural capital is an advantage, conjures the idealized noble savage as the basis for the production of new commodities. Whereas the expansion of global markets and natural resources are considered a white male domain, caring for the environment is some indigenous peoples and some women's responsibility. In this new division of labor, the distinction is between who has the right to control resource extraction and who bears the cost of protecting the environment. If policies and interventions have produced hegemonic understandings of nature of indigeneity, indigenous peoples have responded in different ways. In their demands for recognition, territory, and self-determination, they have articulated meanings of indigeneity and cultural difference that are intelligible to the state and other transnational actors and institutions. Going back to my home community, for generations, my people have called themselves Zapotec or Biniza. And what is happening today in this context of land grabbing process is that people are going back to this idea of calling ourselves indigenous. So I'm worried the kind of implications that it will bring by engaging with these global discourses of indigeneity and how far it will take our communities in their fight to control their lands. In challenging these inequalities, indigenous peoples have also attempted to expand the grid of intelligibility that neoliberalism has imposed on indigeneity by demanding more power. As I show in Indigenous Encounters with Neoliberalism, but also what is happening in Nunavut right now is this struggle to expand these powers and to have a better share of what's going on in the Arctic. Indigenous peoples have also articulated non-state-centered understandings of what it means to be indigenous in the contemporary world. In this particular case, I showed that with the case of the Zapatista caracoles and how they are drawing on other types of discourses and other ways of relating to each other within their communities as a way of situating indigeneity in the current context. So in this sense, the book is also about indigenous resurgence and about indigenous resistance. How we as indigenous peoples frame resistance has consequences for the kind of future we want to engender. I insist that local understandings of being indigenous are better served if they are firmly rooted in place and in the different experiences contained there. That is, in notions of local history, traveling and arrival, specific understandings of work, social organization, and communal responsibilities. When these practices are superseded by meta-narratives of timeless, essentialized cultures, indigenous peoples begin to think of themselves in relation to the colonizers and in relation to the binaries of being inside and being out. From my point of view, it is not land-related activities alone that make indigenous people indigenous. These subsistence activities are of little significance without the local web of social, spiritual, and economic relations in which they are embedded. A flexible conception of place as a space and thinking about work as a set of social practices can be useful in grounding our heterogeneous space of autonomy, relationships, and layered indigenous identity. Global discourses shaping the ways that indigenous peoples should represent themselves have done little to take us further and have done little to advance the rights of indigenous women when we think in a broader processes. Imagining indigenous spaces that resist these processes of land grabbing, that resist these processes of commodifying the environment, involves repossessing ourselves, involves creating understandings of gender fluidity and reciprocal relationships with difference. I believe that we need to think about the practices that we engage in and the work that we engage in within our communities and how central the notion of autonomy, self-autonomy, is to these processes in order to take place. Men and women participate differently in the complex system of social and economic production, and they simultaneously access the private, the public, and assume their subjectivity throughout this process. These complexities shape not only how people use the space physically and places, but also how they interpret, represent, and reproduce the self in relation to the social unit. From this perspective, there is no clear division between economic and social practices. Relations to community and attachment to place are not about immobility or about having always been in one place. Attachments to place derive from different fields of relationship with the landscapes. As its core, the notion of autonomy and the notion of work and transversal intersection of place, social practices, and work stand against one size-fits-all definition of indigeneity and uneven constructions of nature. Self-determination from this perspective is not about addressing a past colonial harm, but about how infusing place with the specific histories, memories, and dislocations, and gender meanings of these possessions to recreate self-determined jurisdictions. I believe that is extremely important that when we talk about self-determination, when we talk about these economic processes that our communities are confronting, it is essential that we introduce sort of a gender analysis throughout these processes. A lot of the work that has been done has basically made indigenous women invisible throughout this process, as if women didn't work, as if women didn't create the communities, and so on. I believe that it's extremely important that we gender self-determination, that we gender resistance, and we gender resurgence. It's my belief as well that repossessing space and places involves some kind of inward localism. I'm not suggesting at all that people should forget that they are part of a broader world. Indigenous people have always had this sense of being part of a broader world. What I'm suggesting is that indigenous people can engage with more selectively engage with these transnational forces in order to engage only with the discourses that facilitate or mediates more transformative engagement with our communities. In looking at these whole processes, one of the questions that I was asking in the book is that how has neoliberalism shaped these local agencies and articulations of indigeneity, but also how neoliberalism has been implemented differently in different places. When we talk about neoliberalism, we have this tendency to assume that it is hegemonic, there is no alternative, and so on, that it exists almost everywhere. And what I want to suggest as well is that neoliberalism, although hegemonic, it's implemented in a very unique ways in each locations. That we need to understand these different processes of neoliberalization, and we need to consider what is happening in the broader picture. I believe that Indigenous Encounters with neoliberalism jumps all these scales constantly by looking at the community, at the political economy as well, but also by looking in between. What is like these conceptions of indigeneity in place? How do people make sense of this, of who they are today within the spectrum of relationships covering their communities and so on? I also, in this book, I put a set of interrelated arguments, but I'm not gonna go there. I invite you to buy the book so that you can explore some of these arguments. So, in the conclusions, what I'm pointing out is that I have noted 4 paradoxes of these processes. Global state articulations of indigeneity unevenly empowers indigenous peoples. And what I mean by this is that when these definitions of indigeneity are so fixed and make us look like we are still living in a past that never existed, really. So it's really becomes extremely complicated in the sense that that's what is happening in my community right now. We feel that we are Zapotecs. We define ourselves as being Zapotecs. But these discourses of indigeneity that are becoming universalized through national constitutions and the Declaration and so on, are sort of making people like my people, some of the communities, but at least that we don't necessarily fit this definition of indigeneity, and regardless of how we feel who we are, and so on. I believe that these global articulations of indigeneity are creating more exclusions than inclusions, and that we need to go back to our ways of understanding who we are as people, as nations. I also argue that the neoliberal spatial and economic reorganization of indigenous peoples' places rests on simultaneous and contradictory processes of capital accumulation. Also, although neoliberalism, as I mentioned, is hegemonic, we need to understand the specific context and circumstances, and but more importantly, the colonial history of these locations. Without an understanding of a comparative understanding of these colonial histories, I wouldn't be able to understand what was happening in these four locations. So in grounding this historical analysis, I look into settler colonial studies and post-colonial studies to make sense of the different modalities of governance in Mexico and Canada, and trying to understand how that colonial history impacts the way in which indigenous peoples today assert their identities, but also continue to resist these processes. I see the book as an intervention in the Canadian community here in Canada, but from a South perspective. And as a comparativist, I'm really interested in showing how these processes create more commonalities and similar challenges that indigenous people are facing here in Mexico and in other places. As a comparativist, I'm not interested in maintaining these geopolitical distinctions between the global South and the global North. I'm really critical of these divisions. I believe that they create sort of like a compartmentalized vision of the world where some indigenous people here don't see any kinds of commonalities in other places. In doing that, sort of as I mentioned before, this is sort of like an academic intervention from the global South in trying to invite and encourage discussion across borders and so on. Although this book draws on my doctoral dissertation, obviously it became something completely different. It became a new research project. My father passed away 7 years ago, so he never had the chance to see the product of the research he asked me to undertake. Perhaps he will be happy to know that, at least for now, my community has been really good at keeping these corporations away from our lands, although we don't really know for how long. Thank you for listening. Thank you.
So we have some time for questions or comments.
Thank you for your talk. I was just wondering if you see any complications in the term neoliberalism. As you mentioned, we tend to think it's hegemonic, it's the same everywhere. You could say the same for colonialism. We know that it had some similarities, but it is similar or has differences in other places.
Yeah.
Why not just say capitalism?
Yes, and that's a good question. Thank you for that. One of the reasons why I decided to engage with, specifically with neoliberalism as opposed to capitalism was precisely because I believe that within this neoliberal regime, what is different is, like the fact that indigeneity is being recognized as something that wasn't considered necessarily before, right? But also the fact that this is connected to an economic process. And I'm really interested in complicating indigeneity when you talk about indigeneity and its connection to capitalism, or accumulation of wealth. I should say that better. That we need to think about that. So that was one of the biggest reasons why I basically focus on neoliberalism as opposed to a discussion on capitalism, right? And you're right, when we look at the literature, neoliberalism as a concept has been used to catch up all, right? But we need to be really careful in how, in the ways we are theorizing about neoliberalism, so that we don't get lost and calling neoliberalism everything and nothing at the same time. Yes.
Thank you very much for the talk. I'm a visitor
Thank you.
to UV from Japan. And I'm not Japanese. And I live as a minority, actually, which is a difficult. But in Japan there is a group called the Ainu.
Yeah.
You're aware of it, and this isn't my area, but I'm interested in how the Ainu population has declined in Japan very seriously and has been touristified. It's actually a very poverty-stricken culture, I believe. And this is because of policies by the government. This is the nature here. What I'm interested to know is, in this beautiful house, which I'm very privileged to sit in, how far are we talking about managing decline rather than looking at a renaissance?
The decline of indigenous population, you mean? I guess it depends on like places you're looking at. You know, when we look around the world, I believe that there are some communities that are really tiny, where the issue that is at stake is the social reproduction of these people for the future. And as far as I am concerned, I don't, and maybe I'm wrong, but I haven't come across a lot of knowledge where the government is having an active approach in maintaining these people. What I can see in many cases is that the state policies are rather aiming at reducing, basically making these populations disappear, right? So that's what I believe that a lot of these policies do. And what I mentioned in this particular work, when we talk about this definition of indigeneity and the fact that a lot of communities don't fit, is a way of saying, well, these people are not indigenous, therefore they cannot enjoy any of these rights. So, you know, like a part of the process that I see regarding my home community, we are sort of like a set of communities that are, you know, autonomous communities. Some people living on the highlands, some people living on the coast. That's where I come from. So different landscapes, right? So the law, the recognition of indigeneity would recognize those living in the highlands because they're living in the forest, but not the people engaged with agricultural subsistence, right? So what I'm saying is that, well, these policies apparently are recognizing something. At the end of the day, what they are doing is reducing the number of people that can make claims of indigeneity. So I don't know if that responds to your question. Thanks. Yeah.
When talking about opposition to binaries, is there a place within indigenous nations or movements to challenge colonial Western gender and sexuality binaries?
I would say so. You know, like it's, when we just think about men, women, it becomes extremely complicated, right? Like what do you do if you don't feel that you fit any of these categories, right? So, and that's complicated, you know. Where I come from, there are a lot of people that, you know, men particularly, that have assumed on the roles of women. And they are sort of really well known for this, but perhaps it would be interesting to know whether or not the fact that they are sort of, you know, playing these roles, that female roles, is because these gender binaries, as opposed to you can be anything without necessarily having to perform a role in the public space, right? And that's another problem that we know that in a lot of indigenous communities, understandings of gender, at least in some places that I know, are far more fluid. That is not just either or. So there are possibilities. When we think about the world about either or, we constrain our possibilities. Thanks. Yeah.
I'm interested to hear about your observations between, I guess, youth engagement with these topics.
About, sorry, I couldn't hear.
Of youth engagement
Uh-huh.
with these topics of indigenous resurgence and questions of identity between the varying communities, and whether or not you see, or there already are existing projects of collaboration of youth, and I don't know.
I've seen some. I seem like not everywhere, but some of the places where I see more youth engagement was in Chiapas, for instance. People that get engaged into education projects or economic projects and so on, or simply want to go and visit these communities and volunteer work, right? So where they're, in exchange, they're sort of getting all this training and being socializing into these different kinds of spaces, right? So I definitely believe that young people have a very important role to play when we talk about indigenous resistance and indigenous resurgence. It's sort of like, you know, in about bringing new ideas and thinking about their own realities, right? Like their own realities and aspirations. And I believe that we need all of you doing something, right? So not just few people, but all of you and your energy and so on to get engaged into this. Yeah. Well, I see a lot of limitations, right? Like one of the limitations that I see is that the term indigeneity is sort of being defined and constructed by different actors everywhere, right? So we have the states, we have the communities, but we also have the World Bank, the United Nations, and all of these actors have an interest in defining indigeneity in certain ways, right? And the way in which indigeneity has been defined is that, to me, you know, is a replication of colonialism in many ways, because they're not really considering indigenous peoples in, you know, how indigenous peoples understand their own history, their own self, and the fact that, you know, living in a community in a spectrum of relationships and so on, that in itself might be complicated. But it becomes further complicated when you have this sense of who you are by being part of these communities. But then, you know, like it's something, a definition of indigeneity that might not necessarily talk to you in many ways, right? Either because there are people that are, that for many reasons, having continued with their connection to land. Many also because these definitions of indigeneity insist in maintaining things as opposed to allowing for change. And, you know, societies evolve. Indigenous or not, societies evolve, you know. To pretend that indigenous peoples, because they are indigenous, they have to continue to be living in a way that other people imagine, I see that as a problem. That is extremely problematic. You know, when people come to my community and said, you know, subsistence agriculture is useless, well, I think that they need also to ask these people why, in the first place, they continue to be engaged. They are getting something out of it, as opposed to nothing. But all these discourses is about, you know, you need to change. And the way I read it is that you need to stop being Zapotec. Just move on. Just privatize your land and sell it, as opposed to you keep maintaining who you are, right? And that's the pressure. And because in the region that I come from, the majority of the lands are sort of, you know, communally owned, they can't really sell it or buy. So now they are sort of implementing, in other communities, they have done this, implementing these kind of contracts, 99 years for a contract. Basically, these peasants are going to inherit these contracts to their kids, And when we talk about indigeneity as for people living in the forest, the way I see it is that, again, landscapes are not clearly cut. People living in the forest, they are as Zapotecs as we are in the coast, meaning that they still, subsistence agriculture is important to them. But because they live in the forest, and because environmental governance now says that this community have to reduce the footprint, they have to abandon that and get engaged in other kinds of things, in a kind of economy that is substituting subsistence food with cash, right? So it's creating a lot of problems. So at the end of the day, even those that are recognized as indigenous are not getting what they should get. Oh yes, absolutely. Especially in the global south, when they talk about red, and I think I opened the book with this little story about this indigenous woman in Cancun, when they met and talking about red, and suddenly she was saying, thank you to the Mexican government, now we can just take care of the environment. Give me a break. So what are you talking about, right? So this is not something that these women, the idea that, red is going to help them out because it's really gender-based, it's just ridiculous. These women and these men also are doing a lot of work that is unpaid labor. They are creating and protecting all these forests so that corporations in the global north can buy these credits. And who is paying for these people to protect those forests? Nobody. But that's what indigeneity means. And that's what the problem is that I have with the term, and the ways in which it has been defined. That it's completely different from how people understand themselves from the communities. That's just for the government. That's just for the government. Yeah. And and the entire sort of a power asymmetry that exists between rich countries and poor countries, right? It's another division of labor that is occurring between what is called the global north and the global south. And now when these kind of processes are happening in the global north, then we need to start thinking about, it's still valid to use these terms, global north. Maybe they are obscuring a lot of different processes going on in what we call rich countries, right? So we need to start talking about those pockets, as opposed to say, Canada is a rich country and everything's fine. Yes?
I want to thank you for your talk.
Thank you.
Thank IGOV as well. I'm from the Tehuantepec Nation, which is southeastern corner of BC, and one of the jobs that I have through the work that I do there is on our constitutional drafting. And the question I had for you was the concept of citizenship. It's one of the things that I'm sort of faced with right now. How do we have a term that's used all the time is Tehuantepec citizen, and I find it really difficult to move forward with that because the concept of a citizen, to me, seems to be one of a man living in a city who owns property, who votes, and that's totally antithetical to the concept of what is Tehuantepec and the matrilineal society. So, any comments on that? I'd appreciate it.
I guess as I listen to you speaking about engaging with the term citizenship, I don't know if it is useful to think about using the term citizenship within indigenous nations, right? Like thinking about indigenous peoples as nations. And when we use the term membership, sometimes I feel like somehow we downgrade these ideas of nationhood, right? For the lack of a better term that I don't know what would that be, I think that we can still talk about citizenship within that nation. Obviously, I would say that the way it is going to be articulated is different from the state, national state understanding of citizenship based on rights and so on. Maybe we need to think about, rather we need to think about, you know, what kind of responsibilities we have in our communities that make us part of this community, right? It's not that I'm not Zapotec because I have rights. I'm Zapotec because I have certain obligations with my family and communities and so on. And because I participate of these relationships, you know, kinship relationships and so on. Maybe the issue is how we articulate it, how we think about this term that can be useful. Yeah. Yes?
I'm not an academic, and I don't have an intelligent question.
Probably you do.
But I have a very great respect for the indigenous tradition. I had a special spiritual experience in 1982, and since then I felt my life very, very, very strongly guided. I've had several indigenous teachers. I know of 2 indigenous past lives I've had, though obviously I'm very white in this midlife life. But I have the deepest respect for what I relate to as indigenous is a deep relationship with the land, spiritually and environmentally, and the traditions and community and respect, and I think that your people need to lead our people. It looks like it's going the other way, and I'm sure at some point it's going to change again. I hope.
Well, maybe you can talk to your people too.
I work hard on behalf of indigenous people, not in particular, but in general, including the Red Foundation. But I just want to say that for me that's indigeneity, and I believe that we all have indigenous hearts and indigenous past lives.
Probably. Thanks.
And I think that we need right now academics like you who can speak to the academics at that level about respect and fair play and what dictates your traditions and customs are that we can benefit.
Thanks. Sorry, I can't hear you.
Yeah, sorry. I spent the beginning of my life in El Salvador during the Civil War.
Uh-huh.
And my dad is Filipino, and so I always had an understanding of that struggle in Central America in terms of what indigenous revolution and resistance looks like. And then coming here, it was really interesting to see the contrast of how indigeneity is approached or the concept here. And one thing I find really remarkable consistently across the board is how people who are very complicit in the process of colonization and dispossession here can look to Mexico and see a movement and really want to support an indigenous insurgence there because they're not personally implicated. And so I'm really curious to hear from you as someone who's done work both in your own community and then up in Nunavut and seen across those political boundaries. Like, what are the main similarities and differences in terms of that government and neoliberal strategy towards disavowal and erasure? You know, because I think that it's the reincarnation of the same intention, but with different tools in different places. And I know that in the global south, like
Yeah, but just one part of it. Just, I see that the TRC is just one part of this process, right? So, excuse me. I think that there are some important differences in terms of the colonial histories and the relationship with land. To me, it's, you know, like the colonial governance processes because the emphasis in Mexico, and for that matter in other Latin American countries, was the exploitation of resources and labor. Land was not necessarily taken away from indigenous communities. Where I come from, 80% of the lands in Oaxaca state is communally owned, right? Like, it's one of the states where more land is owned by indigenous communities than in other places in Mexico. And one of the ways we understand that is because this emphasis on exploitation of labor, right? As opposed to here, where is, you know, from a more settler colonialism perspective, you know, like I wouldn't say that right from the beginning, but later on it became sort of like this, you know, like the idea, the target was land, right? And you need to empty it of people, you know, like take that people away and put them somewhere else. So these are two different modalities of governance that I believe that when we talk about the recognition of rights, somehow in Canada it becomes about recognizing these people's land title and then figure out these arrangements so that, you know, little is actually kept, right? And the process that I see in Mexico is the other way around, in the sense that because these people are still in the land, all these processes are about kicking them out. Something that happens here long time ago, right? So, like at all the processes and social reorganization of indigenous communities is sort of like if I could put it, nobody's talking about it, but if I could put it this way, would be sort of creating some kind of reserves, where basically they are trying to reduce people's footprint so that they can have access to all these environmental commodities and so on without the obstruction of these communities. They tried to create a land market in the 1990s when the NAFTA agreement was being negotiated, and it failed because the communities refused to sell their lands, and they kept everything communal, right? But now we've seen another wave with other strategies of putting people out of the land, or taking people out of the land, right? So, you know, when I first started being interested in this kind of comparative work, one of the things that surprised me the most was the fact that in these meetings, or these sort of like hemispheric meetings with indigenous people, the emphasis would be in the recognition of land title in Canada. But in Mexico, in other Latin American countries, people will rather talk about recovering human dignity, because that was colonialism took away. That personhood, that humanity, right? They kept the land, but that humanity was sort of taken away from this kind of colonial governance. And that's what people are aiming at, recovering that sense of who they are, right? And that combines with more contemporary processes of pushing people off the land. So that creating all these kind of contradictory dynamics within our communities. Yeah. There was somebody else around here?
Yeah, I have another question. I wanted to ask about what possibility of collaboration or maybe possibility of conflict you see between indigenous groups and campesino non-indigenous groups, specifically in Mexico or Latin America.
No, yeah, I know. It's just that I'm thinking that sometimes I have a little bit of discomfort with the term peasants in how it's been used, has been used in Mexico and Latin America, just because it was kind of an instrument to, again, reduce the number of indigenous peoples, right? By saying, oh, these people don't speak their language anymore, even though their governance practices in terms of the land and so on. But because they don't speak the language, sort of you stop being indigenous, and they are called peasants. Some scholars have taken that as to suggest, oh, these people that were calling before peasants, now they call themselves indigenous. And I don't think that that's true. You know, the term peasants was created by the state. It was sort of like a really important way of eliminating indigeneity, but also about changing the foundation of land ownership. With it, the ejido was created, which is a type of communal land plot that cannot be sold or rent or anything. But what's important about that is that the ejidos don't necessarily belong to the communities, but to the state, right? And that's really different from other places where indigenous communities themselves are the owners of the land, right? So the term peasants have been used as well historically to reduce the number of indigenous peoples in Mexico. But I think that the possibilities for coming together are real. You know, that's is happening in the region where I come from. You know, those who define themselves as being Zapotecs and those who don't, they're coming together because they are experiencing things in a very similar way, which is, you know, like the pressure put on them leasing their lands.
Disconnected from their language, how far does this reduce their claim to being indigenous?
Well, in Mexico, historically, has been a way of losing your indigeneity. You know, if we use a different approach in terms of defining indigeneity not in linguistic terms, then Mexico, instead of having 12% of indigenous population, would have maybe 40%, right? So either way, how you define it. So, and I know that in some of these communities, when they don't speak a language, their forms of social organizations could resemble other indigenous communities that continue to speak their language. So, you know, the state was instrumental in many cases in making these people stop speaking their languages, right? So, you know, there are still a lot of people. One of the peoples that, or one of the two languages that are stronger in Mexico are the Nahuatl and Zapotec as well. You know, just because there are more native speakers using it in their everyday life. So.
I'm just thinking, sorry, of in Scotland, for example.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of Scottish people came to Canada. But I mean, in Scotland, there was a deliberate move by the government to stop the use of Gaelic. And now it's only spoken in very, very isolated areas.
Yeah.
So, and in Wales too, for example. So, this was a way of government controlling the claims of individual peoples. I don't know whether you would say the Welsh were indigenous peoples at some point or in some way, or the Scots.
They could have.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
I think this lady was saying that in her past she feels that she was indigenous. I think we could all.
Yeah, like the difference, I guess, is that, you know, I define myself as being indigenous, but not necessarily to this land, right? So,
Yeah.
so it's a different. Up here, to this land. I am indigenous to my homeland, not to this land, right? So that's, I guess, what is different. You know, like it's when you feel that way. Yeah.
Well, join me in thanking Dr. Altamirano.
Thank you. Thank you, people. I'm going to come more often to U of Vic.
Just a few tokens of appreciation for your
thank you.
talk today, including IGOV shirts.
Oh, cool.
So, you're all set.
Oh, perfect.
So thank you very much.